Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the latest edition of our Art in Focus program, in which we take a focused look at one individual art object, either from our permanent collection or something that is on view in the Art Museum as part of a special exhibition, which is the case for our guest today. This is Marcantonio Raimondi and Raphael's engraving of the Massacre of the Innocents that comes between 1511 and 1514. This engraving is on view in the Bellarmine Hall Galleries at Fairfield University. It is part of the exhibition Ink and Time, European Prints from the Wetmore Collection. And I hope that you will have a chance, if you are local to us, to take a visit to Fairfield. The show is up through December 21st. We are open Tuesday through Saturday from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. We have extended hours until 8 p.m. every Thursday. And you can also visit our website at fairfield.edu/museum/ink dash and dash time, which I will see if I can put into the chat so we can have that direct link for you all. This photograph is giving you a sense of the installation, just to give you a little bit of a sense of scale before I take us back to our main image. And I want to make sure I say this up front, but I was saying it to our friends in the gallery, because as you know, we always do this in person beforehand, and then I come online and do it with all of you. And I hope that you will share questions and observations that you have in the chat as we go, so this can truly be a conversation across the intricacies of technology. And that is that one of the things that sets this engraving apart from almost every other in the Ink and Time exhibition is the fact that it is not, in fact, from the Wetmore Collection proper at Connecticut College. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, the show Ink and Time is about, I think, 55 prints that we borrowed from Connecticut College. They were so generous to lend them to us for a period of 18 months so that my students and I could curate this print exhibition and work directly with the objects. And they call it the Wetmore Collection because almost the entirety of this great collection of prints came through the collecting activity of one fairly unknown woman named Fanny S. Wetmore. And she donated her collection to Connecticut College in 1930. It has been an incredible resource for them ever since. There are, however, a few prints in the collection that came in through other areas. So this and another print in the show say Black Collection at Connecticut College. Because if I'm not mistaken, it was a professor in the biology department whose last name was Black, that it was from his family that a couple of these prints entered the collection. So we always want to give credit to those who made it possible for these art objects to be on view and be saved today. And in fact, that was one of the comments that someone shared in the in-person session. They just marveled at the fact that these things are here at all. That here we are looking at just a piece of paper. I'm going to go back to it on the wall. Not a terribly large piece of paper either. That has miraculously survived from 1511 to be on view in Fairfield, Connecticut in 2024. And she just wanted to know, how does it happen? And there's never truly an answer that we can give. And especially for prints like these simple pieces of paper, very rarely do we know all of the places that they have been and all of their owners. Usually we know how it got to where it is now, and the remainder of its provenance remains largely a mystery, although occasionally there are clues, markings, the mark of a collector on the back, for example, that might be one little data point. But its 5 centuries of existence, we know only the barest glimpse of where it has been and what it's been through. But we'll touch back on that sense of what it's been through in a few moments. So here is a big view, blown up to the edge of the screen, of this print. And since I've taken the caption off screen, you can no longer see it. But when you walk into the gallery, it says Marcantonio Raimondi after Raphael. And that word after is doing a lot of heavy lifting in the gallery. This was when we were planning this exhibition. My husband had pointed out that to art historians, the word after in this context is very clear, and we understand what it's meant to imply. For someone outside art history, he said, well, what does that after mean? Is it after chronologically? And of course, my initial reaction was, it's after. That's what we say. And it can vary a little bit in different contexts. Sometimes it means that a printmaker is imitating or reproducing a work in another medium, a wall painting, a tapestry, making it into a print. In this case, however, that after is the sign of a partnership between two extraordinary Renaissance individuals. On the one hand, Raphael, a name who's probably familiar to many of us, I said we had a couple of students with us in the gallery, and I was like, even if you don't know who Raphael is, you know he's a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle. So I know you've heard his name. And on the other hand, we've got Marcantonio Raimondi, a consummate engraver and printmaker of the Renaissance, although I would say he is well known to some as the guy who was ripping off Albrecht Dürer in the early years of the 16th century by seeing these very popular woodcuts coming down from Germany and then copying them and turning them into his own engravings that he could sell to make money. Dürer famously, though perhaps apocryphally, came to Italy to sue Marcantonio Raimondi for counterfeiting his prints and was unsuccessful, although he got him to stop using Albrecht Dürer's monogram. So that's one way that Marcantonio's name has survived. But the other way his work has survived is the knowledge of this incredible relationship he had with the Italian painter Raphael. Raphael is a painter by training. He's not a printmaker. But he, like so many other artists in the early 16th century, they are seeing the possibilities that printmaking offers. And on the one hand, this is a way to make a composition that no patron has necessarily asked you to make. So there is no person behind the Massacre of the Innocents telling Raphael, I would like you to come up with this composition. Please base it on the story in the Gospel of Matthew. Make it dramatic. This is what I would like. No, Raphael has an idea, maybe something coming off the tail end of he wasn't able to use in some other job. He's got this idea rolling around in his mind. No one is necessarily going to pay him to make a painting of it. But if he can turn it into a print, this reproducible art object that could exist in hundreds or potentially even thousands of copies, all of which can be sold. And yes, they'll sell for a little bit less money than that one unique one-off of a painting, but you can get your work out to so many more individuals. You can have a new revenue stream coming into your workshop, and you have this avenue of creativity that inside the patronage system, you might not have had as much direct control. So from an artist's perspective, it's win-win. From the perspective of an artist like Raphael, who doesn't do the engraving himself, though, he needs a partner to make this work. So on the one hand, you have Raphael coming up with the idea and the design, and then you've got Marcantonio Raimondi who can actually turn this into an engraving. But before we think about that and we think about how it's made, let's think about what we see. So we're looking at a scene that appears to be taking place outside. And I think if you walked up to this in the gallery, and I was saying this to some of the folks who attended, even if you had no context for the story, you had no sense of what narrative is being shared here, Raphael has made it really clear that we're looking at a scene of chaos, we're looking at a scene of violence. He has drawn a very clear distinction between male and female in this image. Again, without thinking about the context, we see male figures who are unclothed, so we can see their full bodies. They are the ones holding weapons. We see women and children who have varying body positions and expressions of fear, of horror, and the men are going after the women. Now, knowing then the title of the print is The Massacre of the Innocents, seeing that there are the dead bodies of children on the ground, they're not actually after the women. The men are there on the orders of King Herod to execute all of the infants under 2 because he's trying to destroy the newly arrived Jesus, who he has heard as a threat. That is the story that Raphael is turning into this extraordinarily dramatic engraving. And we see coming toward us, almost in dead center, we have a woman with her mouth open as if she's screaming. She has a baby in her arms. To the left, there's a man with his sword raised, and he has grabbed on to the ankle of the baby that woman is holding. So there are so many different little vignettes of male versus female, even continuing into the rear left. You see a man with his hand outstretched, a woman with her back to us trying to escape. So it's a scene of true violence. Oops, I didn't realize I put that in there. And yet at the same time, we were discussing this together, is like there's a way in which this is also a very bloodless scene of violence, or someone called it a sort of cleaned up image of a massacre. And yes, there are the bodies of seemingly lifeless babies that are on the ground right there in the foreground, but we don't see any blood, for example. And granted, this is a black and white print, but we're seeing sort of the after effects of those children's death. There's also this very stylized, we might even say mannered way in which all of these figures are posed. It's almost dance-like. It's almost like they're ballet dancers performing on a stage that is laid out for us in the foreground. We have a backdrop of the bridge framing the action and the buildings in the distance. But there is something almost unnecessarily graceful, for example, about the man at the left who has that sword raised so that it's almost vertical in the composition. I don't think he needs to have his sword quite that high, but what it does is it draws our attention to the extraordinary level of naturalism that Raphael has given to his physique. Similarly, on the right side of the composition, we see a woman on her knees. She's trying to push away another one of these aggressors who has his sword is sort of behind him. And it gives him this incredible twisting and turning motion where we're seeing legs and torso and hair and body and the flow of his cape behind him. You could imagine, quite reasonably, if you've read the story in the Gospel of Matthew, there's no mention in there of Herod's soldiers being nude. Like that is not integral to the story. But for an artist like Raphael, he's seizing on this moment to demonstrate his command of an idealized nude male form. As we probably know, one of the hallmarks of the Renaissance was their fascination with the human body. So Raphael is showing what he can do, and he's got this extraordinarily dramatic and violent narrative that is going to help him play this out. I think I put this slightly out of order, but since I threw it in here, I'll mention it here. One of the, we were talking about naturalism and the way that Raphael is really committed to trying to design something that is going to make you feel that this is really happening in front of you, even if it's a little bit like a dance performance. And one of the visitors in the gallery had mentioned the shadows, the richness. I'll go back to the full view for a second. Look at the cast shadows that are on the ground. Okay, you get this strong sense of light coming in from the left that is driving those shadows across what looks like the bottom of a piazza, like you might find anywhere in Europe with its inset tile panels, or inset stone panels, I should say. And then when you really take a close look at what is producing the effect of those shadows, it takes you back not just to Raphael, but to Marcantonio Raimondi's role in what is happening here. So he said it's Marcantonio Raimondi after Raphael. What does that mean? Raphael comes up with a drawing. He comes up with a design. Raphael does not have the skills or the interest in obtaining the skills to become an engraver on his own. It takes a lot of training to be able to turn your idea, your drawing, into markings incised into a copper plate. And some artists like Albrecht Dürer, that is something that they learn, they absorb, they do it themselves. But if you're Raphael and you're more of a painter, you're also an architect, he has so many other jobs going on in Rome at this time, it can make perfect sense for you to establish a collaboration with someone who, like, engraving is their bread and butter. And what we are pointing out is that what Marcantonio has needed to do just to create those shadows, I'm going to try not to blind you with the shine of a copper plate in the camera, but imagine having a copper plate that is the size of the Massacre of the Innocents, and you have to take this lovely tool that is called a burin. It has kind of a unusual shape, a long shaft, and then at a bent angle, we have this sort of mushroom-shaped wooden tip. You would put in the palm of your hand. You guide with one finger on the shaft. And then you have to come in. If you're Marcantonio, you have to come in at a very shallow angle to the plate. And every line that you see printed on the final impression of the Massacre of the Innocents, that is Marcantonio Raimondi very carefully pushing that burin in its diamond-shaped tip, pushing it through the metal, removing a thin line where ink will later fall. As you can probably see in this detail, in order to get something like the shadow to create the modeling of form around the ankle, then the deepness of shadow on the surface of the piazza, he's got to go in with cross-hatching and keep making cross-hatching, crisscross lines, being careful that you don't want to mark up the plate so much that it becomes a puddle of ink, but enough so that when this is run through the intaglio printing press, you have this rich sense that, yes, this is a scene in which we have highly naturalistic bodies. We have the modeling, the chiaroscuro of light and shadow. We have the sense of strong cast shadows on a flat surface. All of that work that is shared between these two men. one who is coming up with the visual idea and one who is transposing that idea to a metal surface to allow this thing to take its form. So giving credit to our friend Joe in the gallery, who really was interested in those cast shadows. And another close-up detail here that's just showing you closer to some of the action in the center, it's the almost center of the print. And you'll notice here we have, again, this woman who her eyes look like they're turning a little bit to her right as she's running directly toward us, the viewer. And one of the things I find really interesting about Raphael's choice here, backwards, wrong way. I'm gonna go back to the main view. When Raphael is figuring out what this composition is going to look like, he is a Renaissance artist. We often find with Renaissance artists that things are very much, they're interested in balance, in harmony. They may often design a composition where the most important figure is in the center and things are organized around them to lead your eye there. One of the tricks, you may have heard the term linear perspective. If you follow all those diagonal lines on the piazza, you'll find they sort of appear as if they're going to converge. And their point of convergence is right in the center of that arch under the bridge, which in one view feels like it should be perfectly framing the woman running toward us, right? We might expect to find her dead center and then all of the lines of the composition leading perhaps to her face. And they don't exactly. They lead to the center of the archway, which is just a little bit off center from her. And the reason I think that is an interesting choice is that instead of this being a composition marked by harmony and balance, we have one that is marked by violence, by chaos, by the attack of these soldiers on these defenseless women and their children. So instead of doing what we might expect and making all of the lines converge on her, it's just a little bit off kilter. And one was actually one of my students in my class had asked, well, is he doing that on purpose to like subvert our expectations? Like, I think so. It wouldn't make as much sense for this to be a perfectly balanced scene because the violence that's unfolding here is anything but balanced. So I think that's just a tiny sense of the amount of design thinking that someone like Raphael is doing to say, how can I make the way that I portray the scene match up to the mood that I would like to create? And here that certainly is a mood of violence, of foreboding, of disaster for these women and their defenseless children. When Raphael is working on his side of this task, so we got Marcantonio Raimondi, he's going to come in when it's time to turn this into an engraving on copper. But of course, Raphael is a Renaissance artist. He is going to work this out on paper. He's got his chalk in one image. We have another that's done with pen and ink. These are two very small images, but just showing you the image on top that I'll show you next is in London in the collection of the Royal Trust. And the one on the bottom is in the Budapest Museum of Fine Arts. And since we're talking in the galleries about the miraculous nature of survival, the fact that that little piece of paper is on our wall here in Fairfield, Connecticut, having traveled from Rome in the year 1511. But I was reminding our guests, because prints are multiples, there's not just one massacre of the innocents, there are many that have survived. Their chances of being passed down increase because there are more of them. And then you turn to something like a drawing, which is, again, a piece of paper with markings on it, but each one is unique. There is only one such sketch for the Massacre of the Innocents, as you see at the top. This one, it's the only piece of paper that has these particular markings on it, and it was deemed worthy of survival. So on the one hand, paper is tougher than we might give it credit for, but it's a reminder that at the time that these objects are being made, artists are pushing themselves forward as intellectuals, as opposed to simply manual artists. They're making an argument that they work not just with the hand, but with the mind, in Leonardo's phrasing. And one of the results from that is that every scrap of product that Raphael put his hand on, be it just a simple figural sketch, members of his workshop, collectors, patrons, they are saving that stuff. Stuff that in generations past, well, why don't we have the sketches from earlier artists? Well, often that stuff was used up, thrown out, not considered worthy of saving. And here in the Renaissance, we start to see a sense that, no, we want to save all of this stuff. And we're just fortunate that these sketches have survived in such wonderful condition. So here we have Raphael with a little bit of red chalk. He's not worried about the background. He's not worried about the linear perspective, but he's focused on the figures. He's focused on the bodies, and especially in this sketch, you can see he's thinking about the bodies of those soldiers. He's thinking about laying in the shadow on their musculature to really give a sense of how he can portray the masculine form in this very idealized fashion. And the woman in the center who is running toward us, and you can see the baby is just it's almost like could be a potato that she's holding. Only her leg is really traced out because she's going to be mostly concealed with drapery. He doesn't need to worry too much about the body. That could very well have been one of his male studio assistants, because we know from contemporary practice that who's doing the modeling for Raphael in his studio? It's going to be the guys who work for him. And then he can transform that into the final work into a woman with some hair and accessories and drapery, which may very well be the case there. And in this image, which is not as high resolution as the one that belongs to the Royal Collection Trust, we have a bit more of a developed compositional sketch. We have all of the figures except for the bodies of the two children that'll be in the foreground in the final print. Still no background, still no sense of the lines on the pavement, but now he's really thinking about everyone has their drapery. We're thinking about how these little groups of figures are interacting with each other. And somewhere along the line, a finished drawing that Raphael thinks is good, that will be the starting point for what Marcantonio is going to work out on the copper plate. And the product is this. And I was telling our guests in there that, when I was studying art history initially, that word after almost carried I don't want to say a negative connotation, but it was a connotation of, well, Marcantonio Raimondi, he's got no creative power here. He's just doing it after Raphael, the sense that he's just a mechanical reproducer of whatever it is in Raphael's mind. Art historians more recently have taken up a more nuanced view of collaborations writ large, but a lot of attention has been paid to the kind of collaboration that Raphael and Raimondi had. And we know that there were cases where Raphael may have turned over a really finished drawing and like, here's what you need to turn onto the plate. And there were times when there was probably a bit more of a back and forth between them as they figure out what is going to work best when it is turned into a print. This is not the Massacre of the Innocents, doesn't reproduce any artwork of Raphael's in any other medium. It was made to be what you see. It was made to be turned into an engraving. And sort of reframing that word after to give it a bit more balance also acknowledges the incredible artistry of Marcantonio Raimondi to take Raphael's idea in pen or in chalk and turn it into the engraved marks that we see. So we no longer talk about this only as like, this is Raphael and Marcantonio shoved into a corner. No, we have to give them both their equal weight in helping this thing become what it was. And as a very clear and present reminder that both of them did want to be credited for their role in this, over in the left, sort of cast into shadow, we see on the balcony the inscription that if we read out what is literally there, you would see Rafa Urbi Inven Mf at the bottom. And of course, the assumption is that we are an educated consumer of prints. We would not only know the biblical story on which this print is based and be able to relate to it in that way, but we'd be able to look at that little shorthand inscription and say, it's meant to say Raphael Urbino invented. Raphael of Urbino invented this composition. And that MAF at the bottom, Marcantonio fecit. Marcantonio made this in Latin. So they're both asking for credit there. Raphael for the credit for the composition, for the idea, for the design. Marcantonio for having actually transformed this design into something that is taking place on the copper engraving and the resulting impression. So Carmen just asked, would you also use after with the copies of Durer's prints by Raimondi? That is a great question. I would say one of the distinctions in how we phrase things depends on, well, where are we using it? In a label that you might see on a slide, for example, you have a pretty compressed amount of space, and you might in fact say, engraving by Marcantonio Raimondi after a woodcut by Durer. You might really shorthand it and say Raimondi after Durer, and then take it upon yourself to explain what it is that is meant. If you came and looked at our exhibition, for example, we don't have any of Raimondi's counterfeits on view, but we tried to, in the wall labels, make clear, is this a print that is reproducing something else? Or is this a print that is the result of that kind of printmaking partnership? So it does come down to, are you looking for the quickest way to communicate that one thing after the other? And it will depend on context. And I will say different museums, different entities, they will decide on their own guidelines for how they want to phrase things. It's sort of like a house style, let's say. But I would say there's more been an interest in recent years in trying to just make this a little bit more transparent so the audience can understand what they are looking at. Now, certainly, if you are at an exhibition that I was at an exhibition of Durer's prints at the Minneapolis Institute of Art a few years ago, and they had laid out on the wall this whole dust up that had taken place between Raimondi and Raphael, between Raimondi and Durer. So you have that kind of context supplied to you before you'd see, oh, okay, so here's an original woodcut and here's the copycat engraving that gets made. So I guess the answer is it comes down to context. But that is a really fun story to look into if you are interested. You will find Raimondi continuing to make his knockoff Durers, but no longer copying Durer's monogram, leaving it blank, which is one of the suggestions that the potentially apocryphal court case, maybe it really did happen if he stopped using Durer's monogram. Poor Marcantonio, he's getting talked about as a counterfeiter, but he did do it. You don't want to do the don't want to do the time, don't do the crime, as they would say. I also wanted to highlight, and I did this when we were in the gallery together. We actually talked about this first because I was explaining to the gathered group that here we are in this exhibition. My students worked on it together with me. We had the great privilege, thanks to the generosity of the folks at Connecticut College, to have these artworks on campus for 18 months, which meant that when we were a year ago working on the exhibition, we could have the prints in the room with us, not on a wall framed behind plexiglass, but just in their mats to really be able to engage with them as objects close up. And I showed them this image, which is a photograph of what this impression of the Massacre of the Innocents looked like when we borrowed it from Connecticut College. And I said, is there any reason that you could imagine that we might have been, should we actually put this in the exhibition? And yes, you might be drawn to, there is a shape in the sky, a very clear tear, and this dark stain that is marring the surface, the appearance of the engraving. That is, unfortunately, the result of, at some unknown point in this print's history, because of damage, because there was a tear, someone applied a non-archival quality tape to the back of the sheet. And what that meant was that over time, that non-archival quality, so not a material that we would use in a museum context, it was burning through to the front of the sheet. So in talking about this with my students, they looked at it and they thought, ugh, like, how can we put that on view in the museum? At the same time, we're looking at such an iconic example of Renaissance Italian printmaking. For those of you who know printmaking, you would know that for artists in Northern Europe, Dürer in the 16th century, Rembrandt in the 17th century, printmaking is really central to what they do. For Italian artists like Raphael, it's not the center of their focus. It's something that they do. There's a little bit of a sideline, but it's not quite something that is the focus of their output. And this is probably the most famous of the engravings that the two of them worked on together, Raimondi and Raphael. So me being an Italian Renaissance person, I said to my students, we have to have it in the show. It's got to be in the show. At the same time, it's not in its best state. We're really fortunate that a paper conservator named Sarah Dove, who is based out in Stonington, Connecticut, who is also an alumna of Connecticut College, who had worked with the Wetmore Collection in the past. She came to my seminar. She talked to my students about what paper conservators do, and she did an assessment of some of the prints, and then she treated them. So the print that we've been looking at, the image we've been looking at, is after Sarah Dove has undergone print conservation. She was able to carefully remove the tape to provide a careful repair to shore up the rip in the paper and to remove the staining on the front, which is sort of nothing less than miraculous from someone who's not a paper conservation expert. And she had taken these photographs, which you're seeing tiny little magnets. Those are just keeping it in place for her to photograph in her studio. And the other amazing thing that, we couldn't see in the classroom because this had been mounted to its mat that, had the window, you could open it, but you're not seeing the back of the sheet. A lot of the prints that survive, we have several in the show that had been mounted to a heavier piece of paper at some point in their history, just for support, for protection. This one has not. As you are seeing, the ink from the design on the front has pushed through to the reverse side of the paper. So frankly, that's just cool from my point of view. She also took very careful note of any mark you might see. There's a collector's stamp at the bottom right, EL. So that's one of those little breadcrumbs that you could potentially follow. You might find one past owner that you could associate with that stamp. And what was really cool is that she saw through the sheet that there is a watermark from Fabriano, the Italian paper company, from the end of the 1490s, telling you that this is, if you had any doubts about this being an authentic print, that it is printed on authentic paper of the period. It has the watermark from Fabriano, a company that I think began producing paper in the 1480s and is still active today, which is really extraordinary if you want to talk about survival. So all of that together, Sarah Dove, through her extraordinary skill as a conservator, returned to us this print. You might now look at that upper left and you might be able to see a very, very faint seam where the tear was present. There is the faint shadow of where the stain from the tape was previously. But what her work has done is returned a sense of visual unity. We're not noticing and having our attention drawn away from what Raphael and Raimondi wanted us to see by focusing on damage. So we're really grateful to not just Connecticut College, but to Sarah Dove for doing this and to giving us this print in now this wonderful condition. So we can say that we are returning some of the prints back to Connecticut College in an even healthier state than when we received them, but we don't have to give them back just yet. So as you might be thinking, if you have other questions or observations that you would like to make, I'm going to drop into the chat to the producer, and she's going to drop into the chat that you guys are seeing, the website for the exhibition, Ink and Time, which, as I mentioned, is, she says she got it already. Never mind, Jesse's on top of it. It's on view until December 21st. So if you'd like to come and see this in person, you can do that. If you're not local, but you still want to get a sense of what the exhibition is like, there's a Matterport virtual reality 360-degree tour on that website. So you can read all of the wall labels and zoom in to the artworks that we have there on view. And you'll also see that we have some really awesome talks and events coming up. In November, for example, we will have a curator from the Met European Print Department talking about Raphael and the business of printmaking. And we'll also have a paper conservator, not Sarah Dove, but a paper conservator from the Whitney Museum of American Art, who's going to be talking about the challenges of conserving works on paper in the past, but also working on more contemporary art. So if paper conservation is of interest to you, you can look for that talk on the website. Just checking our chat here. Diane asked, who would buy an engraving like this in 1511? Were they meant for people who could not afford an original piece of art? Was printmaking just a way for Raphael to make money? So I will say, well, when we say just to make money, I mean, making money was in fact the goal for many, if not most artists that we study, even in the early modern period. We just were aware a little bit less of their status as businessmen or businesswomen in those cases where there were women engaged in the arts. In the case of Raphael, he was an extremely successful artist. He made I don't want to call it just a fortune. He died very young relative to other artists at the time, but he had an extraordinarily active workshop. He's taking in commissions. He's working for the Pope. He's being sort of an early archaeologist in 1520, taking stock of all the antiquities in Rome. Raphael is a superstar. And you might ask, is he just looking to make money on the side? Well, that can't be the only reason. It absolutely is attractive to artists that you can make something that will bring in a new revenue stream. Albrecht Dürer made his fortune by realizing the consumer base that he could reach with more modestly priced prints. And in the case of someone like Dürer, we've got so much primary documentation, letters going back and forth. He's writing to his friends. He's talking about how his wife sold this many prints at a fair. We've got lots of information. With Raphael, we know he also had an incredible amount of creative imagination. He's also figured out a way he can have an output for that no one is necessarily going to pay him to do, but clearly he wants to. No one is making this happen except Raphael and finding someone like Raimondi. So we have to imagine a mix of those motives. Yes, it's going to bring in money. Yes, it's going to allow Raphael to experiment with something that he's not doing in another medium. And then we might not think that, does Raphael really need his name out there more? But to an artist, the answer is always yes. And really, they would talk about in terms of fame, increasing your fame. Artists wanted to be known. They wanted to be respected. And here we have Raphael and his city, Urbino, invented on the print itself, no one buying this wouldn't know that they're buying something made by this guy named Raphael. So lots of those motives always sort of overlapping. And of course, it's slightly different for, for every artist, depending on what we know about them and their activity in the graphic realm, we might say. To answer your other question, Diana, who would buy an engraving like this? I mean, in theory, prints were open to anyone. I don't know in practical terms how much this engraving itself would have cost in 1511 or 1514. Not as much as a painting, not as much as a sculpture, certainly not as much as a tapestry, which, if you might surprise you to know, was the most expensive form of object you could commission, unless you're commissioning a building. So we can certainly say that it's opening up access to art to more people than who would have been able to directly commission a one-off art object from any artist. And when I mentioned before, the idea that that inscription is assuming a certain amount of education and sophistication on our part, I'll also point out that it's not necessary to appreciate this as an art object to come to it, for example, as a Christian wanting to meditate on the story of the Massacre of the Innocents. You wouldn't need to know Latin, you wouldn't need to know who Raphael is. So you could imagine someone consuming it or using it in that way. You could imagine someone who is also has that religious motivation, but also knows who Raphael is and is very proud to own something of his. We always just have to imagine competing potential motivations floating around. And we also know that, this is an example of really finely done printmaking. There were absolutely very cheaply done woodcuts, engravings, sometimes with slightly more scandalous content. Marcantonio Raimondi might have printed a more sexually explicit, not made by Raphael, but he was involved in some of the more licentious printmaking, which was often censored by the papal power as being indecent. But there is also multiple currents and multiple levels of printmaking that are going on. If we look at just one print by a famous artist, we won't quite get a sense, but imagine a vast ecosystem that if you've got money, you could absolutely participate in. And I'll also say the cheaper or more disposable prints are the least likely to survive. Ones made by a well-known artist that people are already thinking, yes, this we should hold on to, this we should make sure it's protected, has a better chance of surviving. And Marianne has asked, is the background of the print a depiction of Florence at the time? I don't think it's meant to be Florence, only because if it was, I would expect to see the cupola of the Florence, the Duomo of Florence, or some other recognizable background that's not the Ponte Vecchio, for example, that you see there. But it is, I would say, distinctly sort of Italian. We see the rounded arches of bridges you could find crossing over bridges in Rome, for example. But it's definitely meant to tell you that this seems to be happening if you are the consumer in 1511. This is happening in your time. And granted, the figures who are wearing clothes, those are sort of draperies that could suggest the ancient world. But clearly the background tells you, no, this is not happening in Jerusalem. It's not happening in the Holy Land. It's making it even more real to the potential consumer. So that's a great observation. Thank you for asking about that. Well, I don't think we have any more questions coming through in the chat. So I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us for Art in Focus today. Our next in the series, we will be looking at a print by Rembrandt in November. So please join us again, either live or watching on YouTube if you're watching it in a recording. And we'll hope, if you're in the area, to join us for Ink and Time in the Bellarmine Hall Galleries between now and December 21st. So thank you, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.